What I want to do is we only have a short amount of time, so I'm going to jump straight in. I am super excited to have an opportunity to chat with Robbie. I think the work that Planet is doing is exciting, it's amazing, and I want to make sure that you, as the audience, have a chance to ask whatever questions that you might have. So I hope that you'll feel comfortable and confident using Pigeonhole, because I guess that's what we're trying to do as opposed to shout questions out. We're going to go fast, and so be thinking about whatever questions you might have. I'm going to frame it first and foremost. So Robbie, I just went to the website and took the words exactly that are there. The mission of Planet is to image the entire Earth every day and make global change visible, accessible, and actionable. Help us understand what that amazing, ambitious mission statement means.
Well, when 8 years ago, when I was with two of my best friends at NASA, I worked at NASA for about 10 years building satellite systems, mainly for science, just like we were talking about here, the promise of science, but mainly around astronomy missions, trying to understand how planets are formed around other solar systems. But we saw the awesome opportunity to take things that were happening in the consumer device industry, as well as in cloud computing, to bring that to the space sector. And the space sector historically have always been dominated by governments and very large, very, very expensive, and very, very capable satellites. And so we decided to think about, okay, what happens if you can shrink the satellite down, make it super inexpensive, then mass manufacture them. So you have a distributed sensor network. What missions could you do? And when we looked at the problems in the world and we looked at ways of coming up with a business model associated with it, it was either connect the world or enable a transparent planet. And we chose the latter. So in the garage 8 years ago, we came up with that mission statement: to image the whole world every day and make global change visible, accessible, and actionable. 8 years on, we operate now the world's largest constellation of satellites in history. Still this week, after Elon launched another 60 satellites into space, if you guys followed that. And we've been working really hard for the last 5 years or so on the second half of that mission statement, which is to make global change visible, so we can see, as denizens of the Earth, can see change that's happening. Accessible, so it gets into our workflow, so ultimately we can take action, we can do something about it, make it actionable. And so 8 years on, we've been imaging the whole world every week for about 4 years, and now the whole world every day for about 2.5 years. So we have about 1,200 images deep of the entire planet, and that's recorded history. That's really, really, really necessary information for us to understand the dynamic nature of our planet, and the fact that we're massively terraforming the planet over time.
So the good news is that once Planet becomes legendary and epic and people look back in history and say, how did this thing start? The good news is you do have the required garage in which you imagined and started up.
It's true.
So at least you've got that thing going for you. And people can come and see that garage, and it will be an important place for them to visit.
Yeah, so for those that don't live in suburbia America, everyone has garages, and that's your spare room if you have a project. So it is true. We did start in a garage.
And all great Valley companies have to start in a garage. I want to take a moment and explore a little bit, because take action is a big thing.
Yeah.
Right? So satellites have been able to help us observe things for years and years and years, or decades. This leap now into, if you see something, how can you take action? Can you help us understand a little bit the bridge between all these images you're gathering and the interested citizen scientist, or maybe not even scientist, but the interested citizen? How do you make that bridge between, I've gathered these images and you can do something that is important to you, and how you take that action based on this information? What's that walk? Or what tools are you building to help them do that?
Well, I think when it comes to take action, that there's no one tool nor one data set that you need in order to understand what is reality, what is real, what's about to happen, so that you can mitigate challenges, and ultimately use data in order to make data-informed decisions, better decision-making, rather than an opinion or just a guess, really. So let me unpack it a little bit. It's true, satellites have played a major role for us to understand the climate, for us to understand the ozone layer. NASA scientists saw the hole in the ozone in the 70s. That was validated and found and discovered with Earth-observing satellites. We use them right now as critical infrastructure for weather prediction and modeling, but then to also understand sea surface temperature, to understand how thick the polar ice caps are, and so forth. And sadly, a lot of our models are being updated now with better data, which is proving that the forecasts of impact of climate change was not aggressive enough. Yeah. We are in a knee of a curve, right? And us as humans, we're terrible at seeing exponential trends. Everything looks linear to us when we're actually looking at yesterday and tomorrow. It's going to be about the same. But the reality is that we are in that knee of the curve with respect to the climate crisis, and also, I would say, biodiversity crisis around the world today. So how do we take action? Well, I think number one is we actually still need to make it visible. So even just having this data available as a fact, just a picture, speaks 1,000 words. And that's very useful to tell a story. And in fact, if you think about something that is new that happened today versus yesterday, that's news, right? And so the media program that we have at Planet, we allow for journalists to have access to this to then tell a story, a data-driven story, to then see changes over time. And there's a new realm of geojournalism, people that are telling a story that takes about 3 or 4 months, rather than just the flash in the pan or the news of the day, to actually see how things are actually shifting over time. And if that comes from a data set that is trusted, the veracity of the data is true, then we at least get toward a point where we have a common operating picture as a society, so that then reasonable people can dispute around what it means and what it signifies. But the promise and the direction of where things are going with respect to technologies on computer vision and artificial intelligence and natural language processing, when you bring them together to a vast, rich data set like this, we're going to be able to get to a point where you can look for little micro changes or little indications of something about to happen, and then you can mitigate the negative effects around something that you would have just been hit with without knowing otherwise.
So it's an awesome power that you will have, not necessarily you as a firm, but this awesome power of all of this imagery, how it's changing, what it can predict and point to. Inevitably, the question has to be asked, is there ethical boundary around what type of data, into whose hands, for what purpose? Because as exciting as it could be to help us mitigate undesirable things, it could be used in other ways too, as every technology can. How do you think about that as the co-founder of Planet?
I think it's an awesome responsibility for any technology-driven company to be aware of and to anticipate the effects of your product and service on society, and to also look around the corner around how it can be gamed, how it can be manipulated, so that you can then anticipate what's about to happen and try to avoid the downsides. I think one of the greatest ways to do that is to wrap your business model around the effect that you want to have in the world, or your theory of change. If you have a business model that is very different from what the majority of people are using your product for, then over time, your promise to your users versus how you make money might diverge, and you can lose a lot of public trust and so forth. And I think that we see that today with a lot of big tech companies, in particular with advertising models and so forth. So I think that there's an element for all business leaders to be aware of the effect of your product and your supply chain, all of your activities on society. And for those that are looking around the corner on that, I believe we have a very inefficient global economic system today. The majority of things that we value as humans are not in the economic system. And we are getting to a point now where you can measure externalities more directly, and that in order to make it through this century sustainably as a species on our home planet, we are going to have to change some business as usual practices and take responsibility for the even unintended consequences of your product on society. So absolutely, I think the ethics of any deep tech technology company has to be at the core of the founders and the leaders of the organization, and good governance, right? So when I went to business school 15, 20 years ago or something, people talked a lot about corporate social responsibility. What we have today is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And I think governance is a key part of ethics. So any sort of purposive organization, you can't claim neutral technology. I think that's trite, and I think that's a cheap answer. You instead need to internalize your ethics, and you have to have good governance around how you do that. And so that G part of ESG, I think we're just at the beginnings of thinking about how we bake ethics into all organizations, all global organizations that are reliant on us to enjoy a globalized world.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question here, because all technology at its moment of discovery or creation or invention, whichever word, has amazing attributes, and plastic is the one that we like to think about because it's only been around 100 years, more or less, and it was an exponentially growing technology. Everything is wrapped in plastic or shipped in plastic, etc. But now we realize more and more the downside of that, and microplastics are essentially omnipresent. They're discovered everywhere, including what was thought to be virgin waters in Antarctica and so on. As you and other entrepreneurs continue to think about more technology being launched in and utilized in space, and you want to build a durable, multi-decade company, how do you think about this idea that some people raise, micro space junk, or as things break into smaller particles, they become terrifying ballistics the size of a grain of sand? How do you think about this issue long term, dozens of years from now?
Yeah, so the issue is around the commons of space and space debris and the responsibility of that. So it's a challenge. Right now, there are about 2,000 or so active satellites that are up in space. The first satellite was launched in 1957, so there hasn't been a whole lot of activity. But the activities of the 60s and 70s by the Russians and the Americans were one where we weren't really thinking about space debris. And so we're living with that today. There's a lot of old rocket bodies that are up there and dead satellites, and mainly in one particular orbit, and it's in low Earth orbit. And it is a challenge. So right now, there's something called the Kessler syndrome, which is when a dead satellite hits another dead satellite, breaks up, and satellites go 7.5 kilometers a second. So if you're unlucky, that's a 15 kilometer a second collision, which then turns into thousands of little pieces of debris. And then you have thousands of little pieces of debris that go at 7.5 kilometers a second. So that is really bad, and it's known as the Kessler syndrome. The long and the short of it is, if you are a space actor, we have to be aware of this. First of all, space is big, so that's a good thing. Two is you could design your satellite in such a way where you then actively avoid the large pieces of debris. And then three, you design your operations where you don't become debris in the future, right? So you have propulsion on board, or you launch really low so that it then slowly falls down to the Earth and is designed in such a way that breaks up in the upper atmosphere. That's the way that Planet does it. We fly our satellites around 400 kilometers so that they destructively burn up in the atmosphere after about 6 years.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're moving super fast through our time window, and there's 100 things I'd love to ask Robbie, but we don't have the opportunity. Here's what I will say. I guess the space debris also creates unintended consequences because there's entrepreneurs trying to come up with ways to grab space debris. So there's always something positive there. Number two, you're an amazing example of an entrepreneurial scientist building a hard tech company, so we always admire and celebrate entrepreneurial scientists. But I do have to ask you one question as we conclude. I know there's a tradition within Planet of launch pancakes. Can you touch on that for a second? Because even though you're scientists doing hard work, I've seen pictures of you flipping pancakes. Tell us about that as we finish up.
Sure. So, yeah, our first launch was a morning launch, and we've always at Planet. I mean, again, we started in our garage, but that also meant that we had lunch in my kitchen. So we always built community around food. So every office that we've been in, we've had a full kitchen. And so because it was morning, I made pancakes, and then the second launch that came up, we had pancake stuff left over, so we made more pancakes, and then it became a tradition. So yes, we do make pancakes for every single launch, irrespective of the time of day. And it's been something that we call ourselves Planeteers internally. If they're traveling or whatever, everyone makes sure that you're celebrating the launch with a bit of a pancake.
Is it legend, or is it true that the one time you didn't have pancakes, there was a problem, and now it's only reinforced that, in fact, pancakes are a critical part of the launch path?
It is. We've had pancakes every time, including the 2 launches that we've been on that did not make it to space. So we've been to space 26 times successfully, over 350 satellites in space, but we've been unlucky 2 times. Once we lost 26 satellites, the other one we lost 8. And there were pancakes at both one of those.
Okay, so there's no way for us to infer anything. Okay, well, look, I wish we could talk more. Robbie Shingler, building a very cool company called Planet, going to help us with democratization of data. What can we do with that data to not just observe, but take action? Thank you very much, Robbie.
Thank you. Great to be here.